All right, welcome to the Pangburn Philosophy Podcast. This is Travis Pangburn. Today I'm speaking with Gad Saad. He is a popular blogger for Psychology Today and a professor of marketing at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University. He holds the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption, and is the author of The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, plus numerous scientific papers. He's the Godfather. Thanks for taking the time today, God.
Oh, sure. Thanks for inviting me.
So what's new? What's new in the world of God? What's keeping you busy?
Well, other than my, of course, professorial duties, which includes organizing and hosting a symposium tomorrow on evolutionary consumption, which I can talk about a bit if you'd like in a second.
That'd be great.
I'm also still fighting all the lunacy in academia, but maybe if you'd like, I could start with the symposium and then we could move on to the lunacy.
Definitely. Go right ahead.
So for the listeners who may not know what is meant by evolutionary consumption, it's basically the idea that to fully understand human behavior in general and consumer behavior in particular, you have to look at the evolutionary forces that have shaped our minds and bodies. So we don't suddenly throw our biology out the window when we put on our consumer hat. And so more than 20 years ago, I founded and developed the field of evolutionary consumption, and I'm happy to report now that there is a greater number of folks who are working at that intersection. And so I thought I would invite some of the, a few of the leading evolutionary behavioral scientists and some more junior folks to give talks in a one-day symposium. And so I'm really looking forward to hosting them tomorrow.
Right, and this is in Montreal, correct?
This is in Montreal. It's at the John Molson School of Business. If anybody is listening to this and is able to act on this by tomorrow, it starts at 10 o'clock and it goes on until 5. There are 7 speakers. It'll be really lots of fun and very educational, I hope.
Yeah, I hope people go out and check this out for sure. Okay, let's start in with maybe some current affairs of what's going on. Speaking of behavior, what do you make of this Brett Kavanaugh situation?
I knew that's what we would lead in with.
Yeah.
Well, I've actually produced and uploaded, I think, at least 5 or 6 clips on my channel, The Sad Truth, on this issue. I think it's absolute insanity. And let me explain why. It seems to me incredible that you can have an exact repeat of the Salem witch hunt in the 21st century. I don't know if Brett Kavanaugh is guilty or not. No one knows other than perhaps him and the accuser. What we do know is that someone came at the last second, 36 years after the fact, and said, I think that something happened somewhere at some point, at some place, and I need to be believed. Now, that doesn't mean that she shouldn't be heard, and I think certainly people have granted her all the courtesy to be heard, but the incredible response that I've seen from my, quote, progressive liberal friends literally should cause people to have goosebumps running up and down their bodies, because today it's Brett Kavanaugh, tomorrow it's Travis Pangburn, or his son,
Yeah.
or his uncle, or his grandfather.
Right.
I left the Middle East, thankfully, and I came to a country where there are certain indelible freedoms that most of the rest of the world has not always necessarily had. What makes the United States, Canada, and the West in general wonderful, among many attributes, is that we do have due process, we do have the presumption of innocence, and to see sophisticated thinkers, many of whom you've interacted with, many of whom you've organized events for, completely lose their minds because, he must be guilty because he is somehow associated with the Republicans, is insane. And I think people ultimately listen to my position other than because it is very rational. I think it's because I'm Canadian, and so I come across to people as not having a dog in the fight, which
Right.
is exactly true, right? I mean, I don't care one way or the other. I'm looking at it as an impartial observer north of the border, and it makes my skin crawl because it seems astounding that this process can be happening.
Right. So one thing I've heard, Sam Harris came out with this recently. I think he kind of, in his housekeeping part of his recent podcast, he mentioned that if you're hiring, and I'm paraphrasing, but if you're hiring for a job and there's all this noise behind this person that's in line for this job, why not just skip on to the next applicant and then you don't have to deal with all this noise? Do you think that's just kind of bending over essentially to anyone that could come in and make a false allegation?
Of course,
Yeah.
it's insane that he would say this, right? I mean, so what that you've done a scorched earth policy on this guy and ruined his reputation, probably destroyed the emotional stability of his children and his wife. Hey, let's just move on to another guy. And if he had to be the casualty of this great cultural war, so be it. It's insane, right? I mean, I satirized many things about this case, one of which was, hey, why don't we from now on, whenever someone applies for a professorship, we send out a press release stating that he or she is a serial sadistic pedophile rapist.
Right.
And then we will watch how this candidate responds. If the candidate responds in an indignant and angry manner, well, clearly, bruh, he must not have, or she must not have, the emotional stability to be a professor. I mean, it's insane. It's the Salem witch hunt.
Right. Yeah. It's like if you're sitting up and being accused of something, and you're being defensive and defending your character, is that not just a natural response?
I mean, it's the most natural response. I mean, many of us were amazed that he was this restrained, right? I mean, this speaks to, by the way, let's incorporate some psychological analyses here. There is a phenomenon in psychology known as the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is the notion that we often attribute, say we see a phenomenon taking place, we attribute it dispositionally to the person rather than to the situation at hand, right? And that's a big problem because, so let me give you an example. The way that I respond when I'm tucking my children to bed in a warm, affectionate, loving manner is very different than the way that I respond if I am accosted, about to be mugged by 3 young guys in an alley. In the latter case, I might act very violently in defending myself. No one would come to me if they are not naturally lobotomized and say, but hey, professor, you exhibited great violence in that alley. That must mean somehow that you are emotionally unstable. That would be an example of succumbing to the fundamental attribution error. You're attributing something to me dispositionally when it was only the situation at hand that was forcing me to be violent. So here is a guy who's been accused, and again, I'm not suggesting that he is guilty or not guilty, but we do have the presumption of innocence for a reason. And the evidence that has been offered in support of the accuser, nearly every single lawyer that I've heard speak on the matter said that it wouldn't pass the door of their office, right?
Right.
So he responds in an indignant manner. You presume that that's because dispositionally he's a violent, aggressive guy. You don't understand that he's fighting for his life, for his reputation. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, there seems to be a depersonalization or like a demonization here of him, and there's a lack of ability of some liberals to see him as a person, and they're getting, it seems like, triggered by these basic outbursts of emotion that he's having when trying to defend himself in front of his family and friends and everyone.
Well, what amazes me is that many of the folks that you and I know, the supposed intelligentsia, will be the first to criticize the dogmatism of religion. So many of the folks that you can probably list right now, you mentioned one a few minutes ago, has become very famous around the world for critiquing religion, because in having a religious mindset, you are ultimately being dogmatic. You're not adhering to rules of logic and reason and science and evidence-based thinking. So the exact same people who've made their career and reputation on defending these ideals of reason, these paragons of rationality, suddenly become the most fundamental, quote, quasi-religious extremists when it's their pet ideology that's being attacked, right? So, for example, the Trump hysteria is absolutely insane. Now, again, I say this as a Canadian. I appeared on Sam Harris's show 2 years ago, where I offered a very clear, very sober explanation of the types of decision rules that perfectly rational people might have used in choosing Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. And none of those rules required that the people who chose Trump be maniacs and Nazis and toothless KKK members who sleep with their sisters, right?
Yeah.
And yet these supposed rational people are simply incapable of conceding the fact that there might be very clear reasons why people could have preferred Trump over Hillary Clinton, despite the fact that Trump is full of flaws.
Yes.
No, you can't concede that. There's going to be a nuclear holocaust. We're going to lose democracy. Trump is going to outlaw sex, and we're all doomed in the next 20 minutes. It's insane. It's embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, embarrassing is the best stamp to put on this Kavanaugh thing, and I would probably say at least the way Trump is displaying himself. I mean, it seems like the guy's brain is rotting, but I don't think this is going to end in a holocaust or any kind of
well, democracy is going to be end, and democracy is going to end. He's going to declare martial law. This is the incoming of a new dictatorship. Well, we had democracy. It was a good run. I mean, really, you truly believe that this little bleep called Donald Trump in the great history of the United States is going to marshal all of these unbelievably dire consequences? I mean, what kind of hysteric must you be to actually believe these things? But this is what happens when ostrich parasitic syndrome, as I will explain in my next book, infects even otherwise brilliant minds.
Right. Let's move on to some stuff on consuming. I just had this question just when I was looking through some of your work. Why are some of us more driven to consume at a higher rate than others?
Well, it depends what you mean at a higher rate. I mean, I may consume more burgers than you, but you may consume more pornography than me, right? So I don't think there is sort of a...
I'm sure I do consume more porn than you.
I did not mean that in any way to have inside knowledge. It was a complete hypothetical example. And by the way, I consume a lot less hamburgers than I did, having lost over the past year nearly 30 pounds. So I'm very proud of that.
Oh, very good.
Another 20, and I think I will have to register as a dangerous weapon. But in any case, I don't think one can make the statement that I mean, there is, for example, something called compulsive buying, which in a sense might indirectly speak to what you're asking. So compulsive buying is a psychiatric disorder. And so it's not, you're not a compulsive buyer if you buy, 5 pairs of running shoes. Compulsive buying requires that it truly becomes a dysfunction, right? You become financially destitute. Your marriage is ruined because of your shopping sprees. Well, it turns out that 90% of compulsive buyers are women. And the items that they compulsively hoard, if you like, are very much related to beautification. So it's not as though they just hoard any possible product. It's not some women hoard lawnmowers, other women hoard cameras, and other women hoard lipsticks. So the way that I explain it using my evolutionary framework is that many of the maladaptive behaviors that we engage in, right, pathological gambling, pornographic addiction, eating disorders, compulsive buying, are maladaptive manifestations of otherwise adaptive processes. So that women wish to beautify themselves in the mating market makes perfect adaptive sense. When that mechanism becomes hyperactive, right, it is triggered too many times, it becomes maladaptive. You follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so I actually, in several, in two of my books, I discuss what I call the Darwinian roots of dark side consumption. And so, for example, when it comes to pornographic addictions, nearly all porn addicts are male. And this is not specific to the United States or to Tanzania. Anywhere around the world where you have porn addicts, it is much more likely to be men who suffer from that particular condition. When it comes to pathological gambling, it's overwhelmingly men who suffer from it. When it comes to eating disorders, it's almost exclusively women who suffer from it. So the fact that there is a sex specificity to the manner by which these disorders manifest themselves, and the fact that it happens in a universal manner across time and place, suggests that there is a Darwinian etiology.
Right. But ultimately, aren't we just at the mercy of our pleasure drives? So we're just driven to consume. And I guess what I mean by that is I feel like I'm a pleasure junkie because I can't go to the same bagel shop every morning, have the same coffee. Like, I can't get into a routine like that and find pleasure in it. I'm always searching for, like, I feel like I'm a pleasure junkie, but some people are able to be satisfied with, with going to the same shop every morning. So doesn't that come into play here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a psychometric scale, if you'd like, known as the variety seeking scale, which exactly speaks to what you just described, right? Some of us would be perfectly happy to go back to the same restaurant and reorder the same favorite dish, whereas others would become quickly overcome with tedium or boredom, and they need to, as you described yourself, to try something different. Now, it turns out, since you mentioned pleasure seeking, well, how people score on variety seeking is correlated to another personality trait known as the sensation seeking scale. So some of us have a higher threshold in terms of the level of sensation seeking that we aspire to experience in our daily lives. And so these two constructs, if you like, are highly correlated. So I suspect that if I were to administer to you both of these scales, you would score on the higher end of both. You are a variety seeker and you are a sensation seeker.
Interesting. Where do you stand on the evolution of religiosity in the mind? Is this a mind virus as Dawkins might describe it, or where do you sit on that?
Right. Before I answer that question, I just produced a clip on my channel where I regrettably had to criticize. I say regrettably because there are many wonderful things that I admire about Richard Dawkins, how he's popularized evolutionary theory, how he's been such an important public figure coming out of academia. But he recently endorsed a hallucinatorily idiotic article by Paul Krugman, the quote Nobel Prize winner from 2008 in economics, where Paul Krugman was basically saying that the whole, the reason why Brett Kavanaugh was acting the way that he was, and the reason why Trump is the way that he is, and why people voted for Trump is because of this collective white male resentment, right? White males are realizing that they're losing power, and so they lash out. So Brett Kavanaugh was not angry and indignant because he's been accused of being a gang rapist, walking up and down the East Coast, raping everybody in sight. That's not the reason why he was indignant. He was indignant because, Barack Obama was president last, and that really upset him. So I thought that was such an affront to reason, to human dignity, that I went after this buffoon. And what upset me, I say this buffoon meaning Paul Krugman, right. What upset me about Richard Dawkins is that he actually retweeted it, with an endorsement, like bullseye, what a great article by Paul Krugman. So two white men are arguing that the problems that we are seeing is due to, white men. It's insane. Yeah. But anyways, to come back to your question, so evolutionists have actually offered several competing explanations for why religion exists. So one explanation is that religion is an adaptation, meaning that religion itself confers survival advantage to those who are religious. And so the classic supporter of that viewpoint is a good friend of mine, the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson, who argued, using what's called group selectionism, who argued that groups that are religious, by the sheer nature of being religious, have greater communality, greater cohesion, greater likelihood of investing in one another and engaging in reciprocal arrangements, greater demarcation between the in-group and the out-group. And by virtue of the fact that religion promotes all of these things, then a religious group is more likely to outsurvive a non-religious group. So that argument argues that religion itself serves as an adaptation. The second completely different perspective, but also evolutionary, is that religion is an exaptation. An exaptation means it's a byproduct of evolution. It didn't specifically evolve for that purpose, but religion piggybacks on computational systems in our brains that existed for a different purpose. So, for example, the fact that we have what's called agency detection in our brain, well, religion piggybacks on that. The fact that we are prone to coalitional thinking, us versus them, red team versus blue team. Well, here comes religion, certainly Abrahamic religions, that offer exactly that narrative. If I'm Jewish, there are the Jews and the Goys. If I am Muslim, there are the believers and the kuffar. If I am Christian, there are those who accept Jesus in their heart and the rest of us who are going to hell. So there are very clear red team, blue team demarcations. And so from that perspective, if you like that mind virus example that you gave, so that's a different lens to use to understand religion. A third way to study religion is to actually look at the contents of religious dogma and to show that it really speaks to it being made by man. So, for example, Laura Betzig, a Darwinian historian, did a content analysis of the Old Testament, and she showed that male protagonists in the Old Testament have more or less women as a function of their social status. So if you are a prophet, if you are a king, if you are a general, you will have more women than if you are a farmer and certainly a slave and so on, which of course speaks to the fact that reproductive fitness of men increases drastically if they increase their social status. So there are different ways to study religion. I mean, my personal view is that I probably think between the adaptation versus exaptation, I'm more in the exaptation camp. I don't think that we needed religion to have evolved, but religion certainly piggybacks on computational systems in our brain. Did you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I often put religion in the art category, and somehow it kind of made its way into myth. That made its way into kind of infecting what we actually believed is really going on in reality, and
Right.
and I would hope that, and I think we are moving towards what the Greek gods have become. They've become great myths and great art that we can derive films from, and music and different things.
Yeah, and actually to build on what you just said, so in a lot of my work, I talk about cultural products as fossils of the human mind. And so let me explain what I mean by that. So if you're a paleontologist wanting to study the evolutionary history of a long extinct species, some dinosaur species that's been gone for 65 plus million years, well, my currency really is to identify skeletal remains, look for fossils that allow me to ultimately infer all sorts of things about the evolutionary history of that species. Well, the human mind is organic, so it doesn't fossilize. But what I argue does fossilize are the cultural products that human minds leave behind, right? And so you mentioned art, you mentioned literature, we mentioned religion. Well, let me add a few: song lyrics, movie plot lines, television plot lines. So everything that titillates our senses, we could study their content to tell us something really profound about human nature. So the reason why you and I can, since you mentioned Greek gods, why you and I can read a ancient Greek, poem from antiquity and fully understand what this guy was saying, it's because despite the fact that we are separated by a couple of thousand years and he doesn't know how to use a smartphone or doesn't know what a plane is, the software that his brain is running on is identical to the one that is running yours and mine. So therefore, I could do a content analysis. I could look for fossils, basically cultural products across cultures, across time, and I could demonstrate that there are certain human universals, certain universal themes that keep propping up in exactly the same way. So, for example, when it comes to song lyrics, there are some profoundly, similar things across song lyrics. So I could take troubadours from 800 years ago and show that the things that they sang about is exactly the same as what hip-hop artists sing about today. Their style is different. The directness of their language is different. How much profanity they use is different. But there is no culture, for example, where a male is singing to a female and saying, hey, Linda, you're not being very ambitious in your work. No sex for you, right? But the opposite, I could show you a million songs where women denigrate men for not having social status, and therefore there's going to be no loving, right? So the things that men and women sing about in songs is a wonderful window to our human nature.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It just brings up Shakespeare in my mind, and how he created so many interesting concepts, and some of it on piggybacking on what he read and things he discovered. So yeah, it's interesting. I think even he used some fossils from the past and formed some new ones from that inspiration.
Exactly, and just to again build on what we're saying. The reason why Shakespeare is precisely because he understands human nature really well, right? Is because, yes, I mean, he is couching it in a particular dramatic, literary form. But the reason why it hits us and has hit us for 500 years and we get it is because he is speaking about things that make perfect sense to you and I today. Well, that speaks to, for example, in marketing. So when I try to apply these ideas, when I explain how these ideas would apply to consumer behavior and marketing, say to my students, I tell them, look, a good marketer is ultimately one who understands human nature well, right? If you create products that are antithetical to human nature, they're not going to work. So, and the classic example I like to give of that is romance novels, since we were talking earlier about literature. I mean, if we can call romance novels literature. Although maybe some female viewers will not be happy at my saying this because they're very vested in that genre. But anyways, romance novels are almost exclusively read by women around the world. So it's not as though this is a phenomenon that holds true in the US, but in Bolivia, it's more men who read it. So anywhere where romance novels exist, it is almost exclusively women who read them. Well, if I want to understand, for example, what is the ideal archetype of a male in women's fantasies, well, I just look to romance novels, because those who are writing those romance novels have to write stories that are going to titillate the female mind, since it is the female consumer who's going to consume that particular product. And therefore, if I want to understand what is that ideal archetype, and by the way, I'm not using archetype here in the mumbo-jumbo Jungian BS sense, right? I mean archetype in the sense that there is a particular schema that comes through our evolved mating preferences that make men desire certain attributes in women and make women desire certain attributes in men. Well, the typical archetype of the male hero in a romance novel is he's tall, he's a neurosurgeon and a prince, he wrestles alligators on his six-pack, he's reckless and a risk-taker and a tiger who could only be tamed by the love of this one good woman. I just explained to you every single romance novel that's ever been written.
Right.
Well, a company came out some years ago. This is an anecdote that I had heard, so I don't have the exact reference of which company it was, but I think it no longer exists, and you'll see in a second why. And they wanted to break the shackles of this toxic masculinity, although I don't think they had used that term. It wasn't available then. And so they wanted to come up with a new definition of masculinity. They wanted to teach consumers what they should prefer in an idealized man. And so the man should be watching Bridget Jones' Diary while sucking his thumb and crying because his girlfriend left him because he's sensitive, right?
Right.
Guess what happened to that romance novel line?
Probably didn't even sell a copy.
Exactly. So now, what was the error here? It comes from actually a fundamental violation of evolutionary psychology, which is the blank slate premise of the human mind, tabula rasa. Tabula rasa basically says we're all born with empty slates, and ultimately anything that we exhibit, our preferences, our desires, our choices, our actions, our feelings, are all due to some socialization process. It could be advertising, it could be our rabbi, it could be our friends, it could be our parents, but we're born with empty slates. And therefore, if we're born with empty slates, I, as the marketer, should be able to shape you into any trajectory that I want. Well, that's idiotic. No. Of course, socialization matters, but there are some biological blueprints that we come into the world with, one of which is that women are not very excited about fantasizing about pear-shaped guys who have nasal voices.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. So a good marketer is one that offers products within the constraints of our human nature. God damn, this is good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting about the novel. I'm sure there's many loud voices out there that say, well, not all women are going to not want to read that novel, but I think the statistics on that would be very overwhelming. And then the thing comes down to, it's like, how do we know when someone is just virtue signaling and buying something because they want to show that this is, an attractive story to some women, and how do we know that it's being done for that reason and not for the reason of, actually wanting to read this content?
Sure. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned the word virtue signaling. One of the speakers at tomorrow's symposium that I'm hosting is Jeffrey Miller, a well-known evolutionary psychologist, and his lecture is going to be on virtue signaling of both consumers and companies. So it's exactly in line with what you're saying. But to go to your point about the not all, right? Not all women would want, or hashtag not all. This is actually one of the most common points that are raised by supposed detractors of evolutionary psychology. It's just I'm trying to be nice here and as charitable as I can, but it is some of the most idiotic manifestations that one could imagine coming out of a mouth. So here's how it works. So if I walk into a lecture and say, well, Homo sapiens are a sexually dimorphic species, meaning that there are evolved sex differences between men and women. And here's an example. Size is a sexually dimorphic attribute in Homo sapiens, meaning that we are not equal sized. For example, some penguin species are not sexually dimorphic. The males and the females are exactly the same size. Humans, males are bigger than females. That is a fact that is as clear as the existence of gravity. Well, guess what? Some brilliant Einstein will raise their hand in the audience and say, Travis, yeah. But Professor, that doesn't make sense because my Aunt Linda is bigger than my Uncle Joe. Oh, shit, Darwin is dead. Back to the drawing board, evolutionists. We're dead. Yeah. The scam is up. Okay? So if I say, on average, men prefer to mate with fertile women, nubile women, rather than postmenopausal women, but Professor, my nephew, John, is dating Linda the cougar, right? And I think that because a statement that holds true at the population level and that is incontestable at the population level, they think that that's violated by a single datum. So that's insane, right? Every single WNBA player, so women who play in the women's NBA, is taller and bigger than nearly every single man who's ever existed.
Yeah.
Yet that doesn't invalidate the statement that men are bigger than women. And so through all of my work in evolutionary psychology for the past 2+ decades, I've cataloged a bunch of these cognitive and emotional biases. In other words, in my quest to try to infuse evolutionary psychology, in my case within the business school, I've come up across many of these forms of distorted thinking and it's really important that I try to understand them, because if I want to convince you about the merits of evolutionary psychology and understanding human behavior, I have to understand why you're building these obstacles. What is it that's causing you to not accept all of the evidence in support of evolution, in support of the fact that the human mind is the product of evolutionary processes? And so if you'd like, I can maybe discuss one or two others of these types of traps. Is that interesting?
Yes, definitely.
So here's another one. And again, in one of my books, I offer a whole list of these, and it wasn't even a full list. I got too upset after listing the first 9, I think. So here's one. Evolutionary psychologists explain the full panoply of the human condition. In other words, they explain both romantic love and sibling love and parent-offspring love and altruism and compassion and kindness. All of these things are an indelible part of our humanity, and therefore we explain them. We seek to understand the evolutionary roots of all of these realities. But we also recognize that humans can be bad. Humans engage in child abuse. Humans rape. Humans go to war. Humans cheat on their monogamous unions. Therefore, whenever an evolutionary psychologist offers a scientific explanation for those negative manifestations of human behavior, some person will then accuse the evolutionary psychologist of condoning those behaviors,
Right.
of justifying them. Now, this is so breathtakingly idiotic that it really behooves one to understand how could and by the way, these are levied oftentimes by academics, right? And the analogy that I usually use, which makes these people, go away, is I say, yeah, that's great thinking, Einstein. So a oncologist who studies liver cancer is pro-cancer, is for cancer,
Yeah.
is trying to justify and condone cancer, and that usually makes them go away.
Yeah, and Jordan Peterson comes under fire for this all the time. Like if he states something like, agreeableness in women is much higher than men. He'll make he'll make a statement that women are more agreeable than men, and then this people then go to say, oh well, he's saying that he's happy that women are less or more agreeable than men, but that's not what he's saying at all.
Exactly. I think it ultimately though comes from an ideological repulsion to evolution in general, but certainly evolutionary psychology. Most of the detractors of evolutionary psychology are ultimately driven by the fact that they sense that evolutionary psychology is a direct frontal attack on their pet ideology. You follow what I'm saying?
Yep.
The scientific, the quote scientific criticism of evolutionary psychology in most instances is utter garbage. Now, this doesn't mean that evolutionary psychology or any other discipline is not worthy of scientific scrutiny. But to say that evolutionary psychology is BS is equivalent to saying that chemistry is BS, right? It's an idiotic statement that carries literally no meaning. The human mind either came from God or through some other mysterious agent, or it could have only come from the exact same process that explains the evolution of every single other living thing on Earth. Well, the people who don't like evolutionary psychology are oftentimes perfectly happy to accept that evolution explains the behavior of the salamander and the zebra and the mosquito. But don't you dare say that evolution explains the behavior of humans. That's what makes us humans. We transcend our biology. We transcend our instincts. We are a cultural animal. No, you're not. Of course, we are cultural animals, but we are also biological animals. To be human doesn't mean that you exist in a universe where your biology ceases to matter, right? Now, there are other people who are even more paradoxical in their idiocy. They will be evolutionary biologists who accept perfectly evolution, who accept evolution to explain everything in us except our mind. Okay? So if you use evolution to explain how our pancreas has evolved to be of its form, that's perfectly fine. If you use evolution to explain why we have opposable thumbs, that's perfectly fine. But Dr. Saad, surely you can't be such a moron as to think that the organ above your neck that defines our personhood, namely our brain, is due to evolution. Surely you can't be such a Nazi. Well, where do you think that the brain comes from? I mean, evolution explains our liver, our kidneys, our pancreas, our opposable thumbs, but it's another process that explains our mind, right? So again, it all comes ultimately from a revulsion of what they consider are the ideological implications of evolutionary psychology. But there are no ideological implications of evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is nothing more than the application of evolutionary principles to explain the most important organ that defines our personhood, and that's called the human mind. It's as simple as that. So some evolutionists are conservative, some are libertarian, some are liberal, some are God-fearing, some are atheists. We have no vested interest in an ideology. We simply use the tools of the greatest idea that's ever been uncovered, called evolution, to explain our personhood. Simple as that.
Yeah. And the moral of this story is be less triggered by facts.
Well, that's, by the way, something that I'll be discussing quite a bit in my next book. Maybe we can, you want me to talk a bit about that?
Yeah.
Or
What are you working on right now?
so my next book, I'm talking about. The tentative title right now is The Parasitic Mind, and so what I do in the book is I start off by drawing an analogy with other biological realities. So in nature, there are many instances of actual parasites, actual pathogens that parasitize the brains of certain species. So many of your listeners might have heard, for example, of Toxoplasma gondii. So this is the parasite that infects or parasitizes the brains of mice, causing them to lose their innate fears of cats, which is not a good outcome, right? There are other types of brain parasites that will attack the brains of ungulates, deer, moose, elk. And when their brains are parasitized by this parasite, they will engage in what's called circling behavior. They literally will, on the spot, just go around and circle in the same circle, and they can't extricate themselves from that circle. And as the looming predators approach, instead of fleeing, they can't extricate themselves from that circle. Well, I take this idea and I argue, well, humans can also be, by the way, parasitized by actual parasites. But there's the more dangerous class of pathogens that parasitize human brains, and those are called idiotic ideas, idea pathogens, right? So because of our higher order cognitive abilities, we have the capacity, regrettably, to be parasitized by idea pathogens. So postmodernism, radical feminism, cultural relativism, identity politics, the culture of perpetual victimhood, the oppression Olympics, biophobia, the fear of biology. All of these things are terribly bad ideas that cause people to depart from reality and that can cause people to engage in decisions that are profoundly maladaptive, not unlike the mouse who runs towards a cat when it is parasitized by Toxoplasma gondii. And so the point of the book is to first identify these pathogens, these idea pathogens, explain where they arise from. Well, it turns out that they arise in an ecosystem called the university. And this is where the original infection festers. This is where patient zero happens. And then it starts spreading everywhere, so that someone like the accomplished people that you and I both know could become completely parasitized by what I call ostrich parasitic syndrome. Ostrich parasitic syndrome, or OPS, is a class of, if you like, distorted thinking that causes, in many cases, otherwise perfectly rational people to become utterly insane. And so I describe this whole evolution of this disease, and then I offer ways to inoculate yourself against it, to fight against it. And the only way you could do that is through a hygiene of good thinking. And so I offer ways by which you can protect yourself against such bad forms of thinking.
That's a very important weapon.
It is.
Everyone, this has been Gad Saad. I'm really looking forward to the new book, God, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much. Lots of fun talking to you. Thank you.
All right, everyone, this has been the Pangburn Philosophy Podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and let art and science inspire.